At 10:30 on a June evening, George Farrow, retired jobbing gardener, was knocked off his bicycle and killed on a narrow country lane. After interviewing an eyewitness who described the car and driver, the police arrested local businessman Henry Burnett, who today faces a charge of causing death by dangerous driving. He has pleaded not guilty. His wife is seated in the public benches because she will not be called to give evidence. Superintendent Carson is in the witness box.
Bottom Lane crosses the A67 further north and runs about 4 miles to join the Sowerby-Epton Road, the B263. The plough-in is marked and the village of Chelton. There are also 2 crosses marked on the map. One is where the accident took place. That's just outside Chelton. And the other marks where the accused, Mr. Burnett, lives, just outside Paley, about 8 miles on. After the accident, a police patrol car arrived on the scene at 11:05 p.m, and almost at the same time, the ambulance which took Mr. Farrow to Sowerby General Hospital, where he died immediately after admittance. The police took an immediate statement from a motorist, Mr. Driscoll, who had witnessed the accident and gave a description of the car and the driver and the circumstances of the accident. The bicycle was taken away by the police and given to the police forensic laboratory.
Yes, is this the bicycle in question, Superintendent?
Yes, sir, that is the bicycle found at the scene of the accident and belonging to the deceased.
Exhibit 1, my lord. Please continue, Superintendent.
I was placed in charge of the investigations the next day. From the witness's description, I was led to believe that the car that caused the accident was a metallic green Mercedes convertible owned by someone in the vicinity. I made inquiries on all cars answering this description and found that the accused owned a convertible Mercedes sports car, the type known as 350 SL, coloured metallic green, registered number BUR2L. I knew that the accused had been driving this car earlier in the evening because he had been seen by a police patrol car at 8:17 p.m. near Wells Corner on the A135, exceeding the speed limit.
My lord, the fact that Mr. Burnett had been seen exceeding the speed limit at 8:17 on June the 14th is quite irrelevant to this charge.
I adduced this evidence, my lord, merely to show that Mr. Burnett was out in his car that evening a little over 2 hours before the accident, giving rise to the charge.
Mr. Burnett does not deny this. In fact, it's part of his defence. But I particularly object to the witness dragging in a charge of alleged speeding, which is irrelevant and prejudicial.
I must agree with that. The jury will disregard what has been said about the accused having been seen breaking the speed limit earlier on the evening of June the 14th. You must stick purely to the facts bearing on the charge which the accused is actually facing.
I apologise, my lord.
Yes, Mr. Curry.
Please continue.
On the afternoon of June the 15th, I visited the accused and explained the circumstances and asked to see his Mercedes car. He replied that it was under repair in the workshop of his factory.
That is Burnett Components Limited at Stepton near Fulchester.
Yes, sir. I asked the accused why the car was under repair, and he replied that it had suffered damage in a scrape with his son's car in the driveway of his house the previous evening, causing damage to the near side wing, and that he had put the repair in hand early that morning.
That is the morning immediately after the death of Mr. Farrow.
Yes, sir. I asked him why he was in such a hurry to get his car repaired, and he replied, I dislike driving my cars in a dirty or damaged condition.
How many cars has Mr. Burnett?
2, sir. He's got the Mercedes and a Rolls-Royce. There's also a Fiat owned by Mrs. Burnett and an MG sports car owned by the son.
And what did you do then?
I asked the accused to accompany me at once to his factory, and I saw the Mercedes car. This had already been repaired and the wing resprayed. I took the car and submitted it to the forensic laboratory, and after receiving the laboratory's report, I again visited the accused and asked him to give an account of his movements on the evening of June the 14th. He told me that he had been out in the car from approximately 8 p.m. that evening. He said that in company with his secretary, he had first visited a Mr. Danville, a director of his company living at Ash Green, and that's off the map, sir, to the west, and that he had then taken his secretary to her home in Coseley. Then, he stated, he returned home. I asked him when he had left his secretary's house, and he replied, at 10:30. I asked him what route he had taken back, and he replied, the A67 to Wells Corner, and then the A135. I then asked him if he had not, in fact, taken the more northerly, shorter route by Bottom Lane, east of the A67. He replied that he had not. After further inquiries, I again saw the accused and cautioned him and told him that I did not believe his account. He replied, it's true, and I can prove it. I then charged the accused with causing the death of Mr. Farrow by dangerous driving.
Thank you, Superintendent.
Superintendent Carson, you must certainly be congratulated on one thing, and that is the speed of your investigation. The accident that caused the death of Mr. Farrow occurred late on the night of June 14th, and you took over the case early the next morning.
No, sir. I did not say early.
I'm sorry. When did you assume charge?
It was during the morning before noon.
I see. Incidentally, why was that?
Why was what, sir?
Why were you put in charge of this case? You're assistant head of a mid-northern task force dealing with crime over a wide area. Serious crime. Now, why wasn't this investigation left to Fulchester CID?
Well, it was a serious crime.
Didn't you, in fact, ask to be put in charge of this case?
I was instructed to take charge of it by Chief Superintendent Agnew.
But at your request?
I suggested it, certainly.
For any particular reason?
Well, I considered it a matter for the task force.
I see. Now, you've said that you concluded that the car that caused the accident must be owned by someone living in the vicinity.
Yes.
Now, why was that?
Well, the road where the accident occurred is narrow and winding and unlit. It wouldn't be used by anyone who didn't know it.
Or by the same token, surely by anyone who did know it. Whereby an unfamiliar driver might have blundered into it.
Well, I went under a working assumption.
Which led you to start looking for a metallic green convertible Mercedes garage somewhere in the area.
Yes.
How many did you find? Well, how many did you find? You say you looked or your assistants looked. How many such cars did you find?
Well, it wasn't necessary. We immediately found the car owned by the accused.
That wasn't my question, Superintendent. I'll put it another way. This is quite a large area and fairly wealthy. A number of people living here must own convertible Mercedes cars, and metallic green is not an unusual colour, is it?
No, sir.
So if you had looked, how many such cars do you think you'd have found? 5, 10, a dozen?
I couldn't say.
No, because you didn't look, did you,
I commenced
Superintendent?
investigations.
So?
As I said, it proved unnecessary to pursue them.
So, having assumed rather boldly that the car was owned by someone living in the vicinity, and without checking on other cars in the area, you ascended like an arrow from the bow on the car belonging to Mr. Burnett. Rather an inspired shot, don't you think, Superintendent?
We had received other information.
Such as?
Well, there was the report that the accused had been seen in his car earlier in the evening. I'm sorry, my lord, but I was answering the question.
This is perfectly proper in this context.
Thank you, my lord. With your lordship's permission, and in this context, I would like to go a little more into this report of Mr. Burnett's alleged speeding. Now, I think you said, Superintendent, that around 8 o'clock on the evening of June...
I said 8:17.
8:17. Thank you for the correction, Superintendent. At 8:17, a police patrol car saw Mr. Burnett in his Mercedes going along the A135. Now, I don't think you mentioned the alleged speed.
Well, it was 76 miles an hour.
76 miles per hour. Don't the police use a little discretion when reporting speeding offences?
Yes.
In fact, is it not rare for them to bring prosecutions when the offender is only doing, what shall we say, 5 or 6 miles per hour above the permitted limit?
It's still against the law.
Indeed it is, and so they reported it, Inspector. And you had this report the following morning, did you, when you received the news of the fatal accident to Mr. Farrow?
That is so, yes.
Came what, first thing in the morning, did it? A routine matter?
Yes.
Why?
I'm sorry?
Why did you receive this report?
Well, I do receive reports. And as you said, it's a matter of routine.
What, a report of a trivial speeding offence?
Speeding isn't trivial.
You are assistant head of a task force concerned, as we know, with serious crime. And the local police bothered to send you a report of this minor transgression of the speeding law merely as routine? Is that usual?
It happens.
I suggest that it happens because you asked for it to happen, Superintendent.
Are you asking me?
I will ask you. Did you not, in fact, issue general instruction to be sent reports of any infractions of the driving law committed by Mr. Burnett?
No, sir.
I think you should be very careful, Superintendent. This is a matter that can be checked.
I asked for reports on all motorists in the area with bad driving records. I consider them potentially very dangerous.
Well, I have Mr. Burnett's driving record before me. In the past 5 years, he has received 2 convictions for speeding. One last year for driving on a motorway at 77 miles per hour, and one earlier this year for driving on a local road at 35 miles per hour. Now, I'd hardly call that a dangerous driver. Would you, Superintendent?
Well, that is a matter of opinion.
Isn't it rather a matter of victimization?
That, again, is a matter of opinion.
Mr. Dooley, I'm not quite sure what you're saying, unless you are suggesting that the police have pursued improper means in pursuing this case, out of a sort of prejudice against the accused.
My lord, that is precisely what I am suggesting. I'm obliged, Your Lordship. Superintendent Carson, I ask you now, are you prejudiced against Mr. Burnett?
No, sir.
Do you dislike him?
I don't know him.
You know of him?
He's a well-known man.
Well known in the county, in social work, and in industry.
I believe so, yes.
Have you ever had any dealings with him?
Not directly, if that's what you mean.
I think you know what I mean, Superintendent. Before you were appointed to Mid-Northern Task Force and raised in rank, were you Chief Inspector of Fulchester CID?
Yes, I was.
And in that capacity, did you not handle a prosecution of a certain Reginald Mullins, an employee of Mr. Burnett's company, Burnett Components?
Yes, I did.
Now, this was a prosecution for the possession of cannabis, of which some traces had been found in the saddlebag of Mr. Mullins' motorcycle. He claimed that it had been planted there by someone with ill will towards him. On search of his dwelling, a quantity of cannabis was found by the police, which again Mr. Mullins claimed had been planted. This time by the police themselves. Now, that is the case, is it not?
Yes, and it was an absolute lie.
And nevertheless, Mr. Burnett believed his employee's story and paid for his defence by counsel, and in the event, the case was dismissed. Is that so?
Yes.
And he left a strong impression, taken up by the newspapers, that the police had, in fact, framed Mullins.
Which was absolutely untrue.
And this, of course, reflected unfavourably on you, being in charge of the case.
The case was investigated and I was exonerated completely.
But you were deeply embarrassed. And you blamed the present accused, Mr. Burnett.
I have nothing personally against Mr. Burnett.
I suggest that you have. I suggest that the prosecution of Mr. Burnett early this year for driving at 35 miles per hour and the intended prosecution of Mr. Burnett on June 14th for driving at 76 miles per hour are all part of a campaign of harassment directed at Mr. Burnett.
That's absolutely untrue.
And I suggest that you eagerly seized upon this chance, presented by the death of Mr. Farrow, to bring Mr. Burnett to court on a serious charge.
Absolutely untrue.
Well, we shall see about that, Superintendent. I have no further questions, my lord.
Do you wish to re-examine Mr. Golding?
Just one question, my lord. Superintendent, in your conduct of investigations in this case, have you at any time neglected evidence, or distorted, or selected evidence, or secured it by improper means?
No, sir, I have not. Nor would I ever.
Thank you, Superintendent.
You may stand down.
My lord, there is an agreed statement made under Section 9 from a Dr. Balkrishna Gupta. With your lordship's permission, I'll read it to the jury. Dr. Gupta is resident house surgeon at Sowerby General Hospital. The deceased, Mr. Farrow, was admitted to the accident ward of the hospital at 11:30 p.m. on the night of June the 14th, 1973. I was on duty and saw him immediately. On examination, I found he had a fractured skull consistent with receiving a heavy blow from a hard object. I was informed that he had fallen from a bicycle and hit his head on the road, and the injury was consistent with this. Mr. Farrow died while under examination. Death was directly due to the injury he had received. I'd now like to call Mr. Norman Driscoll. Mr. Driscoll, will you give the court your full name?
Norman Leonard Driscoll.
And you live at 13 Mill Lane, Bursell?
The Jasmines.
I beg your pardon?
We prefer to call it that, my wife and I.
Oh, I'm sorry.
At least my wife does, you see, because
You
of
call the house the Jasmines.
yes, my lord.
You prefer to do that rather than to call it by number 13.
Yes, my lord. You see, my wife
We
and I...
understand.
I thank your lordship. Of the Jasmines, Mill Lane, Bursell. Now, what is your profession, Mr. Driscoll?
bookkeeper, sir, but mainly retired. That is, I still do a little,
Yes.
of course, but...
Mr. Driscoll, on the night of June the 14th, 1973, at about 25 minutes past 10, were you travelling with your wife in your car between Chelton and your own village of Bursell?
yes, sir. We'd been to see our married daughter at Epton. We usually go on a Wednesday, but this time it wasn't convenient.
Yes.
because-
Now, I'd like to take you to the point where you just passed through Chelton and were on your way home. Now, will you describe in your own words what happened?
Well, we were driving, that is, I was driving along, and we came to a turn in the road, not a big turn.
Oh, I'm
and
sorry, I should have asked. What make is your car?
Morris Minor, not new, 1953.
And what speed were you travelling at?
20 miles an hour.
Is that your usual speed?
Yes, my wife is nervous, you see.
I understand. Well, please go on. You'd come to a turn or a curve in the road. Now, what then?
My wife said, there's a car coming. I'd seen it, of course. I pulled over as far as I could. There was a hedge. I could feel the branches. And I saw this Mercedes car coming very fast. And then I saw the cyclist on the other side of the road. At least I didn't actually see him. It was more like his shadow, his silhouette, I mean, in the lights. They were very bright. They must have been full on.
And at that point, where was the cyclist in relation to you?
On the other side of the road, a little way ahead and coming towards me. On his side, that is, close to the hedge. He didn't seem to be moving, really, but of course he must have been to have kept on his bike, a bicycle.
And then?
Well, Then this Mercedes car came along at a terrible speed. I thought he would put on his brakes, but he didn't. He just came straight on. It was an open car, grey-green, and I saw the driver, and then it flashed through.
And what did you do at this moment?
I pulled up. I looked out of my side window, and I couldn't see the cyclist, and then my wife said, "He's hit him." I got out of the car and ran across the road, and I could see the bicycle in the road, and then I saw him, the cyclist, I mean, lying against the foot of the hedge. He wasn't moving. I ran back to my wife, and I told her what had happened and that we'd have to get help, and she was very upset, and I didn't know what to do. And then a man came along, so I drove home and I phoned the police. Then I thought I'd better get back there just in case when I got there, the police were already there and the ambulance was just coming.
Thank you, Mr. Driscoll. Now, just to go over a few details of what you've just told us, you say the cyclist, and that is as we now unhappily know, Mr. Farrow, didn't appear to be moving. I take it he was moving slowly.
Well, yes, he must have been.
He wasn't walking or standing.
Oh, no, he was on the bicycle, I could see that. I could see his legs bent.
And he didn't swerve into the path of the car, of the Mercedes?
No, he was close to the hedge. He wouldn't have had time, really.
And the car didn't swerve to avoid Mr. Farrow?
No, it came straight on.
And there was room for it to pass between you?
Oh, yes. I suppose the driver just didn't see the bicycle. In time, that is.
Now, it was an open car and you saw the driver. Yeah. Now, Mr. Driscoll, I want you to be very careful about this. Will you give the court an exact description of the occupant of that car?
It was a man about middle age, and he was square. I mean, he was quite big. And he had hair down the side of his face, and he wore a light coat, light-coloured, that is, with a high collar. That's about all, really.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Driscoll, do you recognise this man in court?
Yes, he's sitting over there.
Thank you. No further questions.
Mr. Driscoll, how long have you been driving?
15 years, sir.
And always this present car, the Morris Minor?
Oh, no, I had a car before that.
I see. What make was that?
Morris Minor.
Oh, you weren't tempted to go for another make when you bought your second car?
Oh, no, I knew this was a good make and reliable, and I don't drive fast.
So you didn't shop around the other makes?
I just like a car that goes. I don't know much about them, I'm afraid.
You don't know very much about them? Mr. Driscoll, you've given a very clear, in fact excellent account of the accident that you saw.
Well, thank you, sir. I have to be clear in my work.
You say you came round the bend in the road, then saw the Mercedes bearing down on you, at, as you say, a terrible speed, headlights blazing.
Yes, that's right.
Well, I suggest that you did not, Mr. Driscoll.
But I'm afraid I don't quite understand.
You did not see a Mercedes. And this was a very narrow road, unlit. The car was coming virtually straight at you, headlights at full beam. All you could have seen was, in fact, the lights. Isn't that so?
Well, yes, at that point.
Ah, but you said you saw a Mercedes at that point. And that wasn't, in fact, true, was it?
Well, no, not really, if you put it like that. But immediately after I did then.
You said that the car, as yet unidentified, bore down on you without checking its speed and passed in a flash. Now, those were your words, weren't they?
Yes.
Yet you were able to notice not only the make, but the colour of the car.
Yes, it was grey-green. Well, a sort of grey-green, sort of.
Grey-green? It's rather an indeterminate colour, isn't it?
Well, I don't know. I'm not sure exactly what it is that you're trying
Well, the road was dark, Mr. Driscoll. You'd just been dazzled by powerful headlights, and I put it to you that you couldn't possibly tell what colour the car was, except that it was dull or a dark colour. It could have been brown or green or even plain grey.
Well, but it was grey-green because they found some of the paint on the bicycle where it had scraped off.
Ah, the police knew, but you didn't, did you?
Well, no, not really.
So, we can say that you didn't really notice the colour, but you were able to notice the make and, of course, the driver.
Yes.
Even though you were still dazzled by headlights and the car passed in a flash, you noticed him sufficiently clearly to be able to identify him later as the accused.
Yes.
And you said that he had hair on the side of his face. In other words, side whiskers?
Yes, that's right.
And that he was wearing a light-coloured coat?
Oh, yes, I saw that.
With a high collar?
Yes.
My lord, I would like to produce the motoring coat belonging to the accused, which is Exhibit 2.
Very well.
Thank you. Now, this coat is the one that Mr. Burnett will say he was wearing on that night, Mr. Driscoll. And with your permission, my lord, I would like Mr. Burnett to put this coat on.
Give the accused the coat. Please put it on.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Is that how you habitually wear that coat, Mr. Burnett?
Yes.
Thank you. Now, would you stand sideways to the witness, please, in profile? Now, Mr. Driscoll, can you see Mr. Burnett's facial hair?
No.
But you said you did. You described him as having side whiskers, but as you can see, they're hidden by the collar of the coat.
Well, it must have been turned down.
Down? In that case, how on earth could you tell that the coat had a high collar?
Well, it must have been half down.
Half down. I see. The driver passed in a flash. You were dazzled by his headlights, but you saw that he had side whiskers, a light-coloured coat with the collar half down.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Burnett. Mr. Driscoll, counsel for the prosecution has already advised you to be very careful, and I can only repeat that warning. You are on oath. Did you, in fact, see anything more than a man at the wheel who could have been any motorist wearing an ordinary motoring coat?
Well, you see, it was after I'd thought about it and tried to remember.
And that was quite different, I suppose.
Well, yes, it was. But the police were very helpful.
I'm sure we're all very glad to hear that, Mr. Driscoll. Now, how exactly were the police helpful to you?
Well, they asked a lot of questions, and then it began to come to me, what I'd seen.
I see. And did the police show you any photographs of men who might have been the driver that you saw?
Yes, they did.
How many?
I think about 6.
And were any of these of the accused?
Yes, one of them was.
One of them was. Now, did they do anything particular to draw your attention to this photograph?
Oh no, they just showed me the photos.
And did you pick out Mr. Burnett?
Not then, not really. I wasn't quite sure, you see. They all looked rather alike.
They all looked rather alike. Do you mean they all had side whiskers, Mr. Driscoll?
Yes, they did.
Mr. Driscoll, returning to the car. Now, we've agreed that you're not an expert, but you can apparently recognize a Mercedes-Benz when you see one. My lord, I have here a number of photographs of large open sports cars, which I would like to show to the witness.
Very well.
My lord, I think I should see those photographs as well.
The clerk will pass them.
The witness first, please. Now, Mr. Driscoll, would you look at the top photograph?
Yes, sir.
Can you identify the car in it?
It's, is it a Ford?
No, it's a Jaguar. Can you identify the second?
Is it a Daimler?
No. It's a Triumph. And the last one, Mr. Driscoll?
No, I'm sorry.
That, Mr. Driscoll, is a Mercedes-Benz. In fact, it's Mr. Burnett's Mercedes.
The case of the Queen against Burnett will be resumed tomorrow in the Crown Court.